In Hockfield LLC, or LLP, which is established back in 1981. Just a couple of many numerous distinctions in his profession of law that I picked out include being recognized 6 times by the Business North Carolina magazine as one of North Carolina's legal elite in the field of family law, including this year. Business Leader magazine named David one of the top 50 entrepreneurs in Charlotte for 2011 because of his innovative uses of technology in the practice of law. David is a member of the Historic Landmarks Commission of Mecklenburg County. In 2012, he co-chaired the bar committee that produced the Mecklenburg Bar's Centennial Exhibition at the Levine Museum of the New South, and that will be on display in the new bar center. He's married to his wonderful wife, Lynn Erdman, a national vice president of the Susan G. Komen Race for the Cure. And he has 2 daughters, Natalie, who is a nurse, and Emily, a UNC grad, is completing a master's degree in teaching. What you may not know about David is that his first job was selling guitars and giving guitar lessons at age 15. He's also self-taught on the guitar. And in 1953, when he was just 4, he was in the peanut gallery of the Howdy Doody Show. I am duly impressed. Please give a warm Rotary welcome to our fellow Rotarian and Renaissance man, David Erdman.
John, thank you so much. This is a privilege. Let's see if we can make the equipment work. Yes, first, my thanks to John Snyder for that introduction. He was responsible for inviting me to be the speaker today, and he, as our former president, is responsible for adding the word history to health and happiness. So I thank you, John, for your service in many ways and that very kind introduction. I also want to thank John Tabor, and in order to make his picture look outstanding, I included Lee's picture. John, we're experimenting today. Most of you may not know this, but my presentation is being videotaped, or at least it's supposed to be videotaped today, and it's being done not at my instance, but at John's instance, wanting to establish a pattern of putting our programs on the web. So we'll see if it works, and we'll see if it's worth being the first show on the web. Also, my thanks indeed to all of you. I did bring notes and I can't see my own screen too well, so we'll do it this way. My thanks to all of you for the privilege of what a lawyer who spoke at this podium 10 years ago called, and I agree with him, the premier audience in Charlotte. So thank you so much for being that and for honoring me with the opportunity to be here today. My speech is entitled Watergate, 40 Years Later, An Insider's View. And of course, like all of my presentations, it's a picture presentation. It was a series of coincidences, intersecting coincidences, that brought me to the Watergate Committee. And so, in the spirit of Rotary, I'm going to tell you how I got where I was at. I am, as John said, a North Carolina native. Bridgeton, North Carolina had 419 people when I grew up there. That's Newbern across the Neuse River from my front yard. And I want to thank Luke Mabry for giving us the idea of showing the view at our front door in our presentations. Well, as John said again, in high school I learned to play guitar. That's me on the right. That group was called the Brothers and the Sisters. We thought we were the mamas and the papas. I did go to engineering school at Duke, and I used a slide rule probably every single day I was there for 4 years, because that was the state of the art in technology in those days. Then, and contemporaneously with using the slide rule that we knew we could count on, I learned to use the computer at the Research Triangle, and that computer was co-owned, it was shared by Duke, UNC, and NC State. It was called the Triangle University Computer Center. And it was wired up to each of the 3 campuses. We had to stand in line to use the connection. I learned to program computers using a key punch machine, which is an invention that is so old it won't even be going to the recycling of old machines that we just heard about. The way a key punch machine worked was that you typed at the keyboard, and across the top where I put that arrow are the symbols that one would be typing, and the holes are read by the computer, 80 characters per card. You make one typo, you throw that card away and start over again. Very tedious. And amazingly, less than 2/3 of a tweet today, 80 characters per card. Well, I did go to Georgetown Law School. And what I did here is, not having the computer up here, normally I like to use the computer to use the arrow, so I put 5 arrows on this picture to show the 5 buildings of Georgetown Law School. It is the largest law school in America. It's also one of the oldest, founded in 1870. And I was very privileged to be there. But the great privilege of going to Georgetown is its location. The view from the law school tells you that I'm only a 5-minute walk from the Capitol. Well, let me explain the word Watergate, because if you leave with no other knowledge today, you'll understand what Watergate comes from. The Chesapeake and Ohio Canal was built through the Georgetown section of Washington about 200 years ago. And by the way, Georgetown is the oldest section of Washington, D.C. It's not even named after George Washington. It's named after King George III. So it predates the American Revolution. The canal was put through, and of course it has a series of wooden locks. There is, for example, a Watergate on the canal. And arrow green there is the canal going through. This is an 1861 map to demonstrate this has been here a long time. The green arrow points to the canal. The red arrow points to where the canal comes into Rock Creek, and the blue arrow points to where Rock Creek, through the Watergate, opened in to the Potomac River. So, when they built the massive complex, they called it Watergate. The blue arrow points to the big Watergate complex, and the green arrow shows where the original Watergate was, where the stream entered into the Potomac River. So you see, it's a historic name, Watergate. Well, this is the Watergate Hotel, and we all know generally what happened. Even if we weren't born by then, we know what happened. There was a break-in that occurred on June 17th, 1972. And what was happening that day was actually the burglars were breaking in for a second time, and they were removing the bugging devices that they had put in on the previous break-in. Because what they were doing was eavesdropping on the Democratic National Committee. So anybody, everybody knew that it had some political motivation. But you couldn't know that it wasn't another Democrat. You couldn't know who it was. You just knew that they weren't robbing anything. They were listening to the Democratic National Committee, who had its offices at the Watergate Hotel. August 1972. 6 weeks later, I show up in Washington, D.C. This is my face from the Facebook at Georgetown. Most law schools are a pretty grim group, but I chose to be happy to be there. And I was happy to be there. Well, one reason I was happy is because one of the great privileges of living in Washington, D.C., particularly in a pre-computer age, I was just reading the Washington Post. And so every day I read the Washington Post with extreme interest because it had so much information. You all remember, I'm sure you remember what a fine newspaper it was known to be. And I was brand new in Washington when I, like every other American, was confronted with this news story, only it was in my hometown paper, Washington Post. Woodward and Bernstein, that's Woodward on the right, Bernstein on the left, and they began a series of exposés explaining the connection between the eavesdropping and what ended up being the White House, and what ended up being not just the White House, but as we know, the President of the United States. Also at that time, if you're in Washington, and I suppose it was true in Charlotte and anywhere else, you started hearing the name of John Sirica. John Sirica, Chief Judge of the United States District Court of Washington, D.C., a Georgetown Law School graduate, was known as Maximum John. He sentenced people to the maximum sentences. So that elicited a lot of guilty pleas to get a better deal, and people would turn state's evidence and help out. So that helped the investigation along because of the power of the federal court. But then a year later, it fell John Sirica's responsibility to decide whether Nixon had to turn over the tapes from the White House. And he did rule that he should, and for that, John Sirica became the 1974 Man of the Year for Time magazine. Well, let's go back. Nixon's second inauguration occurred 40 years ago, just when Obama was re-inaugurated. 1973, January 20th. I was there. I wasn't an honored guest, but I was there. Not to say that I was anything but a law student who wanted to come over and see what was happening. But I stood about as far from Nixon as the blue arrow, and I'll tell you about the green arrow, well, in just a minute. But it was such a memorable day. It would have been memorable. It was a presidential inauguration, for heaven's sake. That's memorable. But it was a gloomy day. Clouds low in the sky. And on top of that, the flags were all at half-staff because President Truman had died within the 30 days preceding the inauguration. And we all knew that Nixon was under a figurative cloud of investigation at the same time. So it was something of a gloomy day. But adding to the excitement, there were 20,000 anti-war protesters yelling 4 more years through the entire 1-hour ceremony behind us back where the green arrows were. And of course they were protesting, it's hard to imagine, but we were still very much in the Vietnam War, and at that time they were protesting the Vietnam War. Well, this is a coincidence. This very week, 40 years ago, is when the Watergate Committee was established. Thursday, February 7th this week, February 7th that year, the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities was established by, I can't even say these words in today's world, unanimous vote of the United States Senate. Even Jesse Helms voted for the formation of the Watergate Committee. And I'll read out loud the charge that was given to the committee, even though you can read with me, because it was such a grave concern of the U.S. Senate that somehow the presidential campaign had been subverted. That not that McGovern would have won, McGovern would not have won. But on the other hand, McGovern probably wouldn't have been the nominee either. Muskie might have been. So it was very deep. And they said, you, Watergate Committee, make a complete investigation and study of the extent to which illegal, improper, or unethical activities occurred during the 1972 presidential campaign and election, and determine whether new legislation is needed to safeguard the electoral process by which the President of the United States is chosen. And that's a big issue now, is voter ID. Well, this was bigger than that. All right. Sam J. Ervin Jr. This is one of those coincidences. He was the only man in the U.S. Senate whose fairness and rigid commitment to the Constitution made him acceptable to both parties to chair the investigation. A very conservative senator who happened to be a registered Democrat. So it matched both sides' needs. And the Watergate Committee was born. By the way, when I look at this picture and I look at this table here today, this table at which I'm standing is about the length of the Watergate Committee table. 7 senators, you see a bunch of people up here, and a bunch of staffers right at their ears. Well, I had an interesting occurrence happen right after Sam Ervin became the most popular new name in Washington, D.C. A very attractive lady, like right here, sat down next to me in my class. Now, I don't want you to think this had never happened before, but it does stand out in my memory. This very attractive gal that I'd never had a word spoken to me by her before, so sort of sidles up to me and she says, "You're from North Carolina. They say that you're the grandson of Senator Ervin." To this day, I still wonder if I could have played that opportunity somehow more to my advantage. But I was so taken aback, I said, "No, my name's Erdman." But you could see how she might have made that mistake. Well, the investigative committee of the Watergate had to staff up very fast. There were 100 applicants for every position. I say 100, there may have been 500.